me tell you about 2001.
The hype on the end of the millennium was a big focus of 1999. It was an era that was truly wild to be alive throughout. One artist whose impact was continued to be felt, even if indirectly, was one Dr. Dre. That being said, it had been 7 years since the world had last heard his own solo artistic identity. As impactful as The Chronic became, there had also been some other huge names involving the art. Sure, his cosigns were popping off, but Dre kept pretty sparse on the mic. Through the ideas of embracing more creative theatrics, the rise of producer identities in hip-hop, and newer collabs that would help pull the strings on this, along with a handful of ghostwriters, a perfect storm was brewed that would not only reach to solidify Dr. Dre's place in the hip-hop zeitgeist at the time, but how good he was at grabbing ears that would help sustain his impact for better or worse. This release recently turned 25 and is, in my opinion, the same timeless slice of time that made The Chronic a classic. It is the 1999 staple, 2001.
When it comes to talking about victory lap albums, Dre's end of the 90s follow-up to his debut, The Chronic, embodies that spirit in full. And I'm not just talking about through songs like the I'm Back Bitch single of Still DRE, which just feels like a sequel to Nothing But a G Thing, and it's another Snoop and Dre banger. A lot of the collaborations on here are people that he helped bring up throughout his era that was the 90s, whether it was giving Hitman his sort of co-starring role on here like he did with Snoop on The Chronic and this newest album. But, I mean, you've got Nate Dogg cropping up on a couple of moments like Explosive and the heavily memed classic The Next Episode.
Smoke weed every day.
8 out of 10. Obviously, Snoop comes back up on that song. Hell, even if Exhibit doesn't necessarily do anything in rap anymore, he crops up on stuff like the classic What's the Difference? A song that also features his obvious big prodigy from the 90s, Eminem, who was coming on here at some of his, like, early but still, like, meteoric rise. His collabs on here and on Forgot About Dre are iconic pieces of his career. But I also think his hook on The Watcher is pretty low-key and kind of helps keep the song sort of bridged together very well. He does reflect on his time in that era, and it kind of further solidifies that sort of victory lap feeling. It's a nice sort of intro that that sort of welcomes the album into this sort of smooth but catchy moment. Not to brush off the gangster rap focus, because that was obviously the focus of the aspects of The Chronic, but outside of the reflective stuff like the singles and the opener. This is very much where a lot of the other highlights on the album lay. I think if there was a moment on here that's aged maybe the debatably most are the skits. Some of the skits on here especially, and the ways that they bridge the album aren't maybe as cohesive as how iconic some of the sequencing itself is, especially in hindsight. You know, there's some storytelling that tries to go on from sort of bitch into the posse cut of Some LA, with some of the skits like The Car Bomb and Education. But I don't think that, like, Bar One, I don't think work quite as effectively.
I also think, like every other rap album from, like, the 90s throughout the 2000s, it's got some skits that are horny as fuck and don't really lend much to any conversation. There's some of the divergence that feel very indicative of the time, similarly to some of the parts that I praised that may not have aged the best.
I will say, that stretch of the record, though, that I was talking about before, like, if we're talking, like, a focus on the gangster side and really giving it a chance to, like, get highlighted, some of the collabs in there, that posse cut is great. And I think that, like, it following the collaboration of Let's Get High, which is, like, a different great stretch of sequencing, is a moment where, like, the album just pivots its themes so fucking well. That Halloween piano flip on Murder Inc. makes for a fantastic collab with Hitman and Miss Rock. The same can be said for the 2-song heater of Act Right and Bang Bang. Very much catchy, but still going hard in the lyrics. But I also like that he gives, you know, someone like Mary J. Blige the spotlight, especially on the closing moment of this, The Message. It has a nice rounding out to the album that, while also very skit heavy and diverts off into its own tangents, something that both very felt of the era and indicative of something that Dre shares with some of the people that he ends up, you know, giving the spotlight, is a love of theatricality in hip-hop, the ways that he uses it to tell stories. I will say that outside of those moments being solely to sort of lend to the sequencing, the album itself does have some choice sequencing as a whole. Like, Explosive Into What's the Difference is iconic. Forgot About Dre through the next episode into Let's Get High is just a 3-hit combo of excellence, which Let's Get High, if we're talking about the moments that lead into the weed focus, that was also on The Chronic, is a great moment for not only Miss Rock, but Corrupt, who is another artist that does crop up on here a couple of times. By the by, I think that Dre, similarly to The Chronic and another album that I'll talk about next year, was smart about the collabs he brought to the table. But even outside of those collaborations, the production on here is also an interesting sort of showcase and evolution of taste. You know, obviously that G-Funk sound that came to prominence post The Chronic especially, and helped sort of like shape my tastes, is an iconic sound, and I think that like will forever be to some degree embraced within hip-hop. But I think that like the way he takes that and builds upon it in a way that adds stuff like, especially the MIDI string focus that crops up on stuff like Forgot About Dre, which, again, the reason why Eminem shines on there is just because, like, that's the vibe that he was working with him on. But, like, that sound is something that I feel like he would continue to build upon. It's a nice showcasing of where he evolved, which I think is also equally important when talking about, like, a sophomore outing, and if we're talking again about, like, embracing one's successes and not only paying tribute to some of what brought you up with some of the collab work and some of the production, because like Still Dre sounds like a fucking iconic Dre-ass beat. The same could be said for The Next Episode. I mean, that song in general, like, it embodies where he came from before going immediately into like his sound now. But like Lightspeed also is another track that sounds like late 90s Dre to the fullest production wise, and I love that about it. That and like the synth sounds on like Explosive are like where he took those sounds, and I really love that. I think that it sounds, again, just as iconic as The Chronic in my opinion. He set a great stage. This album is iconic. It stood the test of time. And while I have talked about a lot of like 2004 was a long time ago and a little bit about 2014 was a long time ago, 1999 turning 25 is a big thing to some degree. I mean, there was that Y2K movie that came out recently as well. Like 1999 Focus obviously was probably going to happen this year. I'm probably will do more of that in 5 years. But I mean, this is a classic. Why not talk about it now? It was a late in the year release, which is also kind of crazy that it just kind of sort of came out at the end of the decade. So I figured I'd just kind of just drop this at the end of the year. Also, he just dropped that new album with Snoop, and I do plan on talking about that in the January wrap-up, so this would be a nice sort of moment to talk about this. I do plan on talking about his Compton album next year, given it turns 10. So yeah, those are my thoughts on 2001 by Dr. Dre, or a look back on Dr. Dre by a kid who heard it in chunks before spinning it in full at a later age. Because this album, I feel like in parts, was inescapable. There's some just iconic moments, some stuff that I absolutely love, and some deep cuts that I honestly think should get more love as a lover of Dr. Dre's sound especially, and I think that like has aged incredibly well given where its inspirations have gone. While Hitman may not have gone quite as far after this album, in my opinion, I do think that there are some voices in here that still get some notoriety in the scene just to show kind of how impactful Dre was, has been, and at this point will always be. Do you like this album? Do you not? Let me know your thoughts in 2001 in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. Thank you so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day. This record is horny as hell, along with, you know, going into the sequels and all that sort of stuff.